Good evening and welcome. If you see me looking at my phone, it's not that I'm tweeting, because you know I do tweet. It's because I've made a few notes. So thank you all very much for coming this evening. And for me, you're witnessing a part of history. Tonight we're here to recognize the contribution of Dame Elizabeth Anionwu to nursing. And that's in the form of this annual lecture we will start. And the inaugural lecture itself will be provided by Professor Laura Sarant, and we'll hear a little bit more later on. But tonight is really and truly about a celebration and a labor of love. I met Elizabeth many years ago when I was just starting off in lecturing at what is now University of West London. Back then it was the Thames Valley University. And Elizabeth was always busy doing different things. But this was always around diversity, equity, nursing, and so forth. And I'm really pleased that, for me, as I said, it's been a labor of love, and for all of you to join us tonight. And as I said, it's witnessing history, and Elizabeth will tell you this, and I meant it in, and now I reflect, and I think how it must have sounded on Elizabeth's end of the phone. I said, Elizabeth, I'm not going to wait till you die to get recognition of your work. We're going to do it while you're alive. So for me tonight is a big achievement that it's come off. So Elizabeth, I'm not sure how that felt, we'll talk about it later on. But I'm of the belief that we don't need to wait for people to depart this world as such to recognize their contributions, particularly in our profession, and particularly when we look at nursing from the point of view of who our nursing philosophers are and who influences our nursing practice and their philosophies. We know that philosophy in nursing is predominantly white. And so we shouldn't be waiting for those people who influence our practice. We should be celebrating them now and having contributions. So I'm really pleased tonight to have Dame Elizabeth Anionwu, who I call my dear friend as well, and to celebrate her achievements and to launch this inaugural lecture. It's for inclusivity in nursing, because Elizabeth's work, when you look at it, and I had a lot of guidance, and Janet File, if she's here, and I talked about this a lot when we were getting this program together. And we looked at all of Elizabeth's work and thought, it's about inclusivity, it's how we include everyone. And it wasn't just about, it's that whole intersectionality of age, gender, sexual identity, those sort of things. It wasn't just one area. And that's why this lecture is about inclusivity in nursing, and you'll hear more from Professor Sarant later on tonight. But with no further ado, I don't want to talk too much because we're running out of time, and I can talk because I'm a lecturer. I'd like to invite Dame Elizabeth to come on, my good friend.
So as you can see, I'm alive. It's a good job, isn't it, that we have a sense of humour? Because to be told that I can't wait until you die, it makes you think, okay. But what a huge honour. And I really want to thank Calvin. He's always Calvin to me, but really I should say Professor Calvin. He's just a wonderful person, so thoughtful, but so hardworking. And every time I see him, I tell him off, because he looks a bit tired. He just needs to slow down a bit, but he's absolutely fantastic, and I think all the students really should know how lucky they are to have you as their professor. Not lecturer, professor. So really I just want to say thank you very much, and thank everybody for coming out. This is one of my first face-to-face events, I can tell you, not quite the first. So I really appreciate everything that everybody's done over the last few years while people like myself have been in hibernation. Because I am now 75 years of age, yes I know. Somebody reminded me, was it Roehampton? Was it the Roe? I can't remember. I'm doing a lot of online, because obviously it's Black History Month. Somebody who was online is here.
King's College Hospital.
King's College Hospital, sorry, King's College Hospital. So we'd virtually finished, hadn't we, the event, and somebody had a question. Yeah, she looked so serious. She said, You tell them what she asked. Go on.
She asked what her skincare regime was.
What was my skincare regime? Well, all my friends would be in hysterics if they heard that. Because what is it? Would you like to know?
Yes.
This is the serious thing about Black History Month. Come on. So it's water and E45.
Wow.
If you'd like to know more about my life, because what I get asked a lot is, how did you overcome the challenges that you faced as a child in a children's home until the age of 9, an abusive stepfather for a few years, wonderful grandparents for my teenage years? How did you get to where you got to? I'm not going to tell you, you've got to read my book. Or if you're too busy to read, which I think a lot of you are with everything that you've got on your plate, it is also in an audio format. And people say I've got quite a nice voice. So you might wish to get the audio book rather than the book. Anyway, that's the sales pitch over. I just really want to thank Calvin again. It's such a huge honour, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Dame Elizabeth. It's an honour and privilege. We're going to have a Q&A with Dame Elizabeth and Professor Sarah later, so we'll get to hear more about that childhood and that life and that story. But now it's my pleasure to also introduce one of my personal giants, Professor Laura Sarrett. With no further ado, Laura.
Thank you, everybody, and Dame Elizabeth, and we'll get to her in the presentation as well. Can I just say before we start that I wore my nice shoes?
Yeah.
Just, because if I've got to stand over there, you won't see them, and I would like you to have the whole experience. That's what today is all about. It is my absolute pleasure and complete honour to give this first Dame Elizabeth Anionwu annual lecture. And when Calvin asked me, happily he didn't say, I can't wait till you're dead, so I'm obviously still in the young bracket, although my son tells me as next year I'll be 60 that I'm knocking 60, but hey, how we go. And I won't tell you my skincare regime, but I do have to say, I also only use water on my face.
Yeah.
So there you go. Anyway, that's another story. So when I was asked to do this, I thought about what did I wish to speak about. Can you all hear me at the back? Okay. And it is Black History Month. We are where we are in this point in time, and we are where we are in our life journey as part of our profession and our work as nurses, working in health, working in care, or just being human. So I thought what I would focus on was actually about how we lead, and particularly in inclusivity, how we manage to lead in periods of silence, where our opportunities, our perspectives, and our realities are not always heard. So this presentation is entitled, in honour of my good friend, on legacy, belonging, and the importance of being heard.
It's the down arrow.
The down arrow,
Yeah.
not the up arrow. See, that shows how my brain works. So here we are, October 2022, and we are not out, but at least we are in, hopefully, the ebb, or the lull, of both coronavirus and we're in Black History Month. And while these two things, if you like, are mutually exclusive to some extent, I do think what we've heard during coronavirus is absolutely entwined with Black experience. Because what coronavirus has done is it shone a light on the inequities and the exclusivity that is part of our social fabric. The virus itself is an equal opportunities virus. However, the consequences and the burdens of the virus are inequitable. And they're not inequitable because of the nature of the biology, but because of the ways in which particular groups in our society, my family, my friends, my communities, my colleagues, are unequally exposed to the virus and unequally exposed to the exclusivity of the way we run society. So I just want us to think a little bit and pause to think, here we are at the intersection of those two things. How that will play out over the next 6 months will also show what we have learned or not about the virus over the winter period. So I want us to be reminded of that. What we know is the consequences of the virus also have been unequal in many, many different ways. Not just in terms of race, but in terms of gender, in terms of the economic impacts of that. More women have actually lost their jobs or become economically worse off as a consequence of the last 2 years. So we must never forget that actually everything that happens is around whether you are in or whether you are out. So last year, every single thing that I read was always about resilience. It was always about, fighting the good fight, working our way through, the resilient nurses. People clapped our resilience. They didn't pay us for it, but they clapped for our resilience. And the picture of resilience that we were sold, and still are to some extent, are these. Juggling many plates, being squashed by competing requirements, and sometimes just being in that pit by yourself, shivering. And I'm not saying that that is actually not right, not true, or a reflection of reality. What I am saying, it is not the only story of resilience that we need to embody. We need to embody different types of resilience, which are about our position, our voices, and telling our own stories. And that's where we're going today. Down arrow, up arrow. So, I want you to imagine being in that place where your resilience is called upon. It's like being in the eye of a storm. And the only thing you know for sure is this little bit of ground where you're standing is relatively safe. It can take your weight. But the noise, the wind, the chatter, the pressures that swirl around you almost freeze you to the spot, don't they? Yeah. You're afraid to step forward, even step back, because you might be swept off your feet and you're not sure if you'll get back to solid ground. And what that does, it remains you stuck in that place. And what we have to find is a way in which to move forward, a way in which to find the next step that says, you're here and you are safe. And that's about being included as opposed to excluded. So, I want to talk a little bit about my life and journey and how it intersects with Elizabeth. And in doing that, I hope that you will learn and have courage to tell your own stories. Because we all have a voice and we all have a story to tell. And if we don't speak for ourselves, other people will speak for us. And at best, they'll get it wrong and mistell our stories. But at worst, they will render us silent and invisible. Silence speaks, always. What is not said about us in the press, in the headlines, in the textbooks, in the case studies, in the good news, is as loud and as important as what they say. So it's our role and out to hold that space for ourselves so that people can hear the silences of our missing voices. The stories that are not told are usually about I, we, and us. We are conspicuous by our absence and omission. And I know that that was one of the triggers for Elizabeth's work around sickle cell. And I know my own work, and we'll hear a bit about that, is I noticed that what was happening on planet Earth where I was not reflected in the books, in the journals, in the gold standard pathways of the systems where I worked. 1982 to 1994. 1982 was when I started my nurse training. 40 years. 40 long years. Still going though. And one of the things that really struck me during that period of time, was how social justice and inequity were often not talked about. I remember when I was 9 years old, and I didn't start my nurse training when I was 9 before you get to that, okay? When I was 9 years old, it was the first time I read Animal Farm. I didn't understand it all, but I read it. And the phrase that struck me in that book was this one. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that is what sparked my curiosity as to why. I was born into a large family. My parents had migrated to England from Dominica. You see, we're little, but we're still at the front. And we were poor. The key thing was, though, I didn't know I was poor until I started my nurse training. That's when I realised I was poor. Because where I lived was very diverse and nobody had anything. So as a child, you only looked to the people to the left or right of you, you know. Hardly any of us had a new pair of shoes. We all got hand-me-downs. In fact, in many of my pictures, when I look at pictures with me and my siblings, we're kind of working out who it is because the clothes are all the same. But that didn't strike me until I went to my nurse training and people started talking about experiences when they were young. And that's when I discovered that actually, not only did some people have a bedroom to themselves, they actually even had a bed to themselves. The first day I slept in a bed by myself with someone who wasn't my sibling was when I went to university. And I remember the first night in the halls of residence. You know, those of you who are old enough to remember the good old days of halls of residence, when you got food and everything and it didn't cost you an arm and a leg. The first night I remember closing the curtains and thinking, I'm in a bed on my own. And that's scary. And that's what led, through my own personal experience, my interest in equity, in everybody having an equal chance of life and health. The first time I was really struck by not just inequity, but how social justice and morality can be the difference between life and death, was when I qualified as a nurse and I worked in the late 80s. I think I did, in those days you had to do 2 years in a hospital to get good basis before you were allowed out in the community. So I qualified in 86 and literally as 365 days came on my second year, I was out there. No offence to my friends in hospital. Because my heart was in the community and in public health. Because that was where people lived with the inequities and social justice that actually meant that, you know, they were more likely to be in hospital. That was where, by living at one end of a bus route or another, there could be 20 years difference in your life expectancy. How can that be when we're in the same system and sometimes even in the same district? How can that be? So that's where I went. And I won't say fortunately, but fortunately for me, it coincided with the AIDS pandemic hitting the streets at its height. And I worked as a nurse and an outreach worker. It says now nicely HIV and AIDS, but we hadn't even isolated the HIV virus. I was an AIDS nurse. And I worked in the community. I worked with all the high-risk groups, which included people in my own family. I did lots of work in Nottinghamshire with prostitutes outreach work. It's a good thing this has been recorded, but I'm old enough not to care now. I've been arrested more time by the Vice Squad and the red light district than you would like to shake a stick at, because they come down and do a sweep of all the women walking the streets, and here was I, a black woman, walking the red light district, trying to persuade them I was not a prostitute. And then I would go to my car to show them my ID, and when they opened my car door, it was full of condoms. Quite hard to explain. So, you know, my manager was very used to getting a phone call all else night saying, can you please vouch for this woman that she's not, no, she's actually a nurse outreach worker. And interestingly, one of the reasons why it was difficult for them to show that I was a nurse on the community was because at that time, you could only enter the community register if you were a health visitor, a district nurse, or a school nurse. If you were just an adult nurse working on the community, you were just an adult nurse. Luckily, things changed a little bit. But what I learned in that time was how the way in which society labels and treats particular people was as damaging as the inequity they were brought up in. That's what I learned. Exclusivity by social agreement. And all the way through this time and doing my training, I felt like this. I like this picture because it's quite hard to tell who's in the jail and who isn't. Who's looking in and who's looking out. And that was the line that I walked. As the only black nurse in my cohort, that's the line that I walked. Going through case studies around transcultural nursing, which flagged up in every single one that the nurse was white and the patient was black. What do I do then in that case? Because almost every interaction I had was a transcultural one. But the books did not reflect. I was invisible in the pages of that book. I learned about shock. I learned about pressure sores. I learned about poor circulation. And never once did anybody mention what that looks like in a black skin. I put my hand up and I asked the question. I don't look like that when what do I look like? And the response was, you'll learn that from experience. I'm sorry. If I collapse in front of you, I haven't got time for your experience to come in. I need you to know that when you leave your training. If we are still not preparing all nurses to actually practice in a way that they are confident and competent in a diverse society, where we have a global majority of people whose skin colour is not white, are they really fit for purpose and fit to practice? That's my question. Answers on the postcard later. The challenges I had in being able to speak out is very much about similar to when I learned about poverty, I hadn't realised there would be such a difference. I was in a utopia that felt, I'm doing nursing, we're here to be good to people, everybody's equal, we treat everybody the same. And then I learned for 4 years, with every turn of the page, that I was silenced. There were discrepancies between the evidence I was presented and my own experience. So questions for me were, so where am I then? Which position do I take when the nurse is white and the patient is black? What does that make me? And if I put my hand up and I speak out, what will it expose about me? What you learn very quickly when you walk a line is that being vulnerable is a risk, and it's whether you're willing to take it. How do I actually do this? 98 to 2004. That's when I met this woman. And let me tell you, she might have a quiet voice, but you know when she fixes those eyes on you, it tells you that voice can be quiet, but it's deadly. And I remember, these are pictures which I know are in your book, and I've read the first and the second book. Okay. And this picture in the middle, I think was one of the proudest moments for me, was when, after years of work, led by Elizabeth, we managed, by selling £1 badges, to have a statue of Mary Sickle with stands That moment of standing on the end of that bridge, it was packed. Do you remember? Wall to wall people just standing there. And with Mary Sickle looking defiantly across at Westminster, we had our day. Only second to the fact I met David Harewood, but that I'm not sure. Anyway. And one of the reasons that I am inspired to be here is I count Elizabeth as my first mentor, whether she liked it or not. And I remember once I was in a dilemma. Do you remember about working with the university, trying to do teaching, battling against some of the discrimination and racism and how I could help these students, and whether or not I was ready to take the next step and stand out and speak. And I remember her pulling herself up to her full height and looking up at me and saying to me, never let me hear you say that someone's told you you're not good enough and you've believed it. And you might not remember saying that, but I remember every single word. So every time I stand up, whether my knees are shaking, I see Elizabeth going, never let me down. Absolutely a giant for all of us. And during that time, that was when I did my PhD, and I came across this quote from Audre Lorde about how we have been socialised to respect fear more than our own needs for language and definition. And while we wait in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of that silence will choke us. The fact that we are here and I speak these words is an attempt to break that silence and bridge some of those differences between us. For it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. I read that and it blew my mind. It could have been Audre Lorde, it could have been Elizabeth Anionwu. And so at the end of doing my PhD, I came out with this concept called screaming silences. I finally had words to explain the experiences I'd had from my training through. The experience I'd had as an outreach worker and nurse with those people living with and dying in my hands with AIDS. The screaming silences, the things that are not said, but are written in between every line of every piece of information that you have. learning to hear and listen to the unsaid as well as the said. And what happens when we continue to make policies, practices, gold standard pathways, case studies, which don't include the silenced or the silent voices. So I started to speak and moved from inclusive conversation to positive action. It wasn't enough just to talk, we had to do. And so I started to ask people, do you actually see me? In all my intersectional fabulousness. Because what I learned in that time, and what I learned from the first time I spoke to Elizabeth and watched her, is that I come as my whole self. And as someone much more famous than me, I may stand here as one, but I come as 10,000. And if I don't speak when I'm in those spaces, I do disservice to all those people who do not have the opportunity to stand where I stand. I also learned to live with being uncomfortable. But being uncomfortable does not mean being unsafe. So I started to create the space around me. Doesn't stop you getting in the eye of the storm, but the space in which I could walk. And the people that I could reach out who would hold my hand, even just to steady me at that point. The question that we have to ask ourselves moving forward is, how do we nurture wellness in our profession, in this space? The simple answer many talk about is giving a hand up, lifting as you climb, helping the next generation through. But I actually like the bottom picture, because in the bottom picture, it's about creating a space around someone's point of view. So you're not just lighting up or trying to see through the telescope where they're looking, but you are creating a beam of light that allows them to move more than in that one direction. Even lighting up things that they haven't seen. And you are behind them, not only pulling, pushing, but also just giving them an equal chance of making a choice. Because choice is a key thing that either helps or hinders us. My favourite quote by Mary is actually about thriving. My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive. And to do it with some passion, some compassion, and some style. The key to thriving when your voice has been silenced, the key to thriving is to hear the silence around you and in you. To listen to that silence and use it, harness it as additional evidence, your hidden superpower, to let you ask that different question, to push that different space, or to make that light for somebody else. That's how we as a profession thrive. Not doing it as me, or like Elizabeth, but in your own way, with your own different resources, so that we have a greater diversity of opportunity for everybody. So, there's a few things I want to say. First thing I want you to do is close your eyes. Listen. And answer me this question. What does your silence sound like? You can open your eyes now. When I say that, some of you might have actually heard the sound going around. Some of you heard yourself and your heart beating. Some of you heard your head going, stop thinking and just be quiet. The problem is as I said, that silence is very rarely silent. It always speaks. So when we say there's no evidence, how do we know that? It's there. You need to look and find it. And the silences that you hold within you are your safeguard. They have brought you safely to this space so far. And when you do read Elizabeth's books, you will see that it's a growing learning about the silence within you and being able to accept yourself as human, but harness that to inform your action, not just for its own sake. So I'm going to share with you a couple of points that I've learned in my 40 years since I qualified. The first one, every data point, every number you look at is somebody's story. In the pages between the statistics and the life expectancy rates is somebody's story. And they rely on you to tell their story so they can be heard. Lisa Nichols says this: we only fail forwards. So when you're in the eye of the storm, stepping forward is scary. But when you fail forwards. At the worst, it's an opportunity to understand what doesn't work, which is just as important as finding out what does. Where the mind leads, the body follows. The mind is your greatest asset to moving on, to taking a chance. It's your greatest asset to finding a solution or a space and a way to say what needs to be said, and speak for those who can't speak, and enable people to speak for themselves who can. The fourth thing is about being human. Gift yourself the grace to be perfectly imperfect, because that's what makes us human beings. And in our imperfections, we allow other people to be human too. It's very easy, certainly when you're in a leading role, to expect perfection in everybody. Yeah. That means you're not seeing them as human as they are. And that's the least we all deserve. So, when you're in the eye of the storm, what is the superpower that helps you? That's the question for you to reflect. That's your homework for you to take away. We do have one area of shared superpower as nurses, and even more so as members of the global majority. We have roots and we have wings. Roots, the legacy that gives us a solid ground to build on. Our heroes and sheroes, like Elizabeth and others, who help us up, who shine a light to say where it's possible for us to go. But the good thing about having giants is that you can see even further than they can. And that is the legacy of continuation. And we have this in the Windrush generation, which is kind of where we started. These are two pictures from Waterloo Station. The first, the arrival, and the second, the monument that stands there now. Our roots and our wings. And finally, I want to close the loop, I suppose. I was fortunate and very honoured to have a poem that I wrote. I actually wrote it for the Chief Nursing Officers Strategic Advisory Group conference in 2017. And those, my friends who are here, will know I wrote it by accident. I don't mean I accidentally wrote it, obviously I knew I was writing it, but what I mean is I wasn't supposed to write it. Do you remember? We had actually wanted to have a much more famous at the time and poet, nurse poet, do a poem for us to celebrate for 2018 70 years of Windrush and also 70 years of the NHS. But we couldn't afford her because we had no funding. So we were thinking, what should we do? So I said, well, I write poetry. I'll write something. And I wrote it on the train going home. And I performed it for the first time at that conference. And that was the first time I ever performed any of my poetry. I have books and books and books of poetry. I can see Joan and Felicia look, I can't even look at them. Because I remember going, oh, I don't want to do it. And they were going, yeah, go on, do it. And I did it. And so to close with the roots and the wings, we started with Black History Month, and I'd like to finish with that. It's about the legacy, about being heard and speaking for ourselves. Because without those nurses who came here less than a month after the start of the NHS, none of us would be here working. The NHS would have fallen at the first hurdle. So with your permission, and my phone, I'm going to read you that poem, the excerpt of which is on the Windrush Monument. I didn't have these glasses when I read it the first time either. But anyway. You called, and we came, in ships bigger than anything we had seen, dwarfing our islands and covering them in the shadows of smoke and noise. Crowded, excited voices filled the air, travelling to the motherland. Over weeks, over oceans, which threatened to engulf us. Driven by a wish, a call to serve, to rebuild England and support efforts to establish health for all in the aftermath of war. You called, and we came. Women and men of position in our islands, nurses with a pride in the excellence of our care, with experience of management, organisation, and a sense of duty. We appeared, smiling and eager to work on the wards, the communities, and the clinics of this England. You called, and we came. Our big hearts, skillful hands, and quick minds encased in our skins of a darker hue, which had shimmered and glowed in our islands, but now signalled our unbelonging. Matrons became assistants. Nurses became like chambermaids, and all the while striving to fulfil our promise, to succour, to serve, and to care. You called, and we came. The blue of the sisters' uniform seemed as far away from us as the moon, unreachable by our dark hands in this cold land. But we were made of sterner stuff. The hot sun which once beat down on our ancestors when they too left their lands shone within us, forging our hearts and minds with the resistance of ebony. You called, and we came. Rising like the phoenix from the heat of rejection, we cared, we worked, and we organised, until the quickness of our brains and the excellence of our care made it hard for you to contain us. And slowly, so slowly, the blue uniforms had darker and lighter skins beneath them. The professional care in our touch was valued, despite the strangeness of our speech and the kinks in our hair. You called, and we came. A new millennium, new hope spread across this land, new populations engaging and reflecting the varied, diverse and vibrant nature of these shores, challenging leadership for health, and moves to melt the snow at the peak of our professions. Recognising the richness of our kaleidoscope nation where compassion, courage and diversity is reflected in our presence and our contributions, not just the hopes and dreams of our ancestors. Human values needed to truly lead change and add value. Remember, you called. Remember, you called. You called. Remember, it was us who came. Thank you.
But I think it's time, and this is a question hopefully will resonate, we go from being the most reflective profession on the planet to inspiring more leaders. So we want to go from voice to setting agendas and taking up leadership roles. Because it's about time we explain that the bulk of the NHS is nurses. And if we allow politicians to maintain control, you'll see what happens to the financial markets happening to the NHS.
Thank you, Michael. So it's about inspiring leaders. Any response? How we inspire leaders?
I think it's not so much inspiring leaders. What I heard was the importance of exactly what we were talking about, of speaking out. And I think often as nurses, particularly, we feel that the only place we have to speak out is actually about direct patient care. And actually, the nursing voice is important at every stage of somebody's journey, which includes, right at the beginning, setting the strategies and policies which drive what we can and can't do in practice. So it's about finding our voice in all those places, included from where we see people straight, research, education, all those. The scope of our practice covers all that. But it starts with us as nurses, because often, even within our own profession, we only recognise a very narrow band of our range as real nursing.
Thank you.
You've said it.
You taught me well.
And anybody else? I'm sure there are lots of questions. Young lady here.
Hello. I feel inspired with the talk today. I'm Amina Nemer. I'm from Egypt. Came long journey to hear this lecture today. I need from you both ladies to give me a message to give back to nurses and midwifery in Egypt, where they are. I took you all to many years. They are now working on the medicalization and the power and authority of physicians, where they're expecting the nurses to obey orders. It's not prescription yet. And as a professor in the Faculty of Nursing, I'm a dean for the Faculty of Nursing actually, and we're trying to teach students and put the curriculum. They are empowered, they have the authority, but we are not teaching the professions yet. We are working in that situation. We are facing students, they are silent, they are frustrated. Whatever you teach them, whatever you try to empower them, but the outside community, even the communities themselves, they are not supporting those nurses.
Yeah.
What I can our voices go.
Okay.
I'll tell you something, if you did what the nurses in this country are voting on as we speak, and withdraw your labour, those medics would soon be scurrying around. Because I know I'm not trying to be facetious, but until what nurses in Egypt are contributing to the life of that country is withdrawn, I'm not necessarily saying a strike, but a go slow, you know, is quite good. That means if you're supposed to start work at 8 o'clock, and you're supposed to have a break at 10 o'clock, and you're supposed to have your lunch at 12 o'clock, and you're supposed to have a tea break, I don't know whether you do tea breaks, but you know, and you finish at 5 o'clock, you stick to that, because most nurses do much more than that. You've got to stun the medical hierarchy. You've got to stun the politicians and make them aware that if you just withdraw a little bit, what is going to happen? Now that's difficult, but they've got to understand what your contribution is and not look down on you and not have this hierarchical approach. I mean, this is what the British nursing profession had to work through. It's not that long ago that nurses in this country were in that situation, maybe not as severe, but if you're not there, or you're not there as much as you used to be, who's going to have to pick up the pieces? Those medics wouldn't want to do. And I'm not arguing medics against nurses here, but the situation you've described makes me angry. It really makes me angry, and one wonders about the role of trade unions, professional associations, international allies, the International Council of Nurses. And, I mean, I'm retired now, so I'm not totally up to date with who you can pull in to support you, because you do need support.
Anything out of silent voices of students, the frustration?
I think it's always difficult, as Elizabeth said. There's a battle, and people went through it in England too. And to some extent, we probably still are in some places, where students in training are taught to be much more kind of direct, understand the critical discussion around health, life, social justice, and all those things, and be more proactive in the way they're thinking. And often we have research to show that sometimes in the first 2 years after they transition into the workforce, they become less loud, because they are sometimes made to fit the existing mould. So it may not be as extreme, but we also need to look within ourselves and say, how are we dampening down the enthusiasm of the workforce that we're actually producing when we really need them? We really need them. And how are we enabling them to actually help with their learning? What are we learning from them rather than teaching them the tasks that we know?
Thank you. Victor?
Thank you very much. 2 reasons for my attendance today, actually. Professor, I know 21 years ago, Thames Valley you mentioned, and quietly I've been following your tracks.
Stalker.
Stalker.
Another stalker on Twitter. Sorry.
And the topic on inclusivity. I've just finished my doctorate. It was I looked at social justice, and you referred to it in your presentation at various stages. You referred to equity, you referred to equality, and silence. What I found, actually, which inspired me to do social justice, was the silence around social justice in our profession. Whilst I was doing my professional doctorate, I had a look at the nursing documents in the UK, and there was no mention of the term social justice. And during the course of my Viva examination, I was asked, is the NMC afraid of the terminology social justice? Not necessarily so, because there are attributes of the term that are being mentioned in our documents. But that's where the silence for me actually comes in, by not being bold to mention it and to exercise it in our curriculums. Because what I found in the curriculum that I am practicing is there's no mention of it at all. We have to try and bring it in at various stages. If you have to talk about health promotion, how do you actually bring social justice aspects into that? How are we going to make it topical here? And how are we, the leadership question my colleague was asking about, when I was collecting data, the nursing organization taking leadership, how can we allow ourselves to take leadership in terms of social justice issues in the curriculum and in the practice?
Good. Shall I take that one?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Remember the slide where I showed you the picture of the one where somebody's helping someone up the mountain, and below it, and I said I prefer the other picture where the light has been shone from behind to allow people to see a greater space. Okay, that's how we include and embed social justice. We've got to remember that progress and change happens like this. It goes in a cycle and it moves forward. We fail forwards every time as we go. And social justice, by people writing their doctorates, people writing papers, and writing it into the language of nursing is how it becomes embedded. Somebody doesn't just wake up and think about it. And as language then gets embedded, we move from language to action. So it reminds me again, so the social justice is about when we do our teaching, our education, whether that's in practice or whether it's in the university, we include a social justice lens, light, to what we're looking at. So for example, when we're looking at, if you go right to the bedside, when we're looking at the range of people who might be having a particular condition, if we know that social inequity plays a part in that, that needs to be part of our thinking, not just about the treatment beyond the drugs and whatever the gold standard is, but to help ourselves and our colleagues to understand how these things differentially impact people and why certain people then end up in the revolving wheel of coming back and certain people don't. In the classroom, when we talk about conditions, we don't just talk about which groups are more and less likely to have that condition. Far too many times we put a slide up that says the group at greatest risk of diabetes and heart disease are black communities, without any discussion around the social justice aspect. So that's how we embed it into our everyday language. So it's not just a theory that sits on a shelf.
Okay. So I have the lady next to Phil, then I have one person here and the gentleman at the back. So this lady here, do you want to ask your question? Yeah.
My name is Yemi Osher. I've known Elizabeth for quite a while now, and thank you, Laura, for that wonderful lecture. And I can obviously resonate with some of the issues that you discussed in terms of social justice. My question has always been that how can we encourage nurses to be more political? Has been an elected councillor for over 7 years, and also work in the realm of social justice, trying to make a difference. I feel like as nurses, we seem to be been silent for a long time. And I just feel that the politicians take us for granted. And I feel so angry most of the time that we have to fight for our rights, for our patients. We talk about social injustice around health inequity, which Laura mentioned. And we continue to talk about it. But it seems that the politicians do not get to listen to what we see as nurses, that we cannot work in isolation until we make those changes for everyone and in addressing it. And it just seems that from the work that I've done on the council, one of the things that I try to encourage nurses is that we need to be in the space. We also need to hold our politicians to account, especially from the local level and in the parliament, and I think that's still lacking. And I just wondered how we need to incorporate that with university in preparing students to be more politically astute, to be able to make sure that we can actually get our voice heard. Because when it comes to elections, we get people knocking on our doors. You get those politicians knocking on your doors to seek your vote. And then when they get there, they become self-fulfilling for themselves rather than listen to the voice of the people. And I think it's because as nurses, which has this global view, we don't hold them to account. And there's a lot of us in this room.
Okay, so the question is, I'm just going to move.
So the question is, how can we bring more political knowledge into nursing?
So how do we get nurses more political, with political knowledge?
I feel that that's kind of what you enacted, Elizabeth, around the sickle cell.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting question. And when I was writing my memoirs, I was trying to reflect. Well, I was being asked, actually, before I wrote my memoirs, how did I do this? Why did I do that? How come you managed to do... And it wasn't just the first and foremost, and I think you flagged this up, is you don't do it on your own, first and foremost. And I think, I'm not always sure whether we're taught that, or whether that that aspect is enabled in discussions. That I mean, there's loads of discourse and on this issue of be very, very careful about putting politicians or powerful people, campaigning people on a pedestal and giving the impression it's a lone individual that is driving this through, because that's how the media can misrepresent. I mean, we have individuals from the Mary Seacole Memorial Trust here this evening, and the shortcut that journalists often took with me was, what led you to create the Mary Seacole? No, just hold on. Lord Clive Soley established the Mary Seacole Memorial Statue Appeal. Why did he establish it? Because 4 Caribbean women in his constituency, when he was a Labour MP in West London, approached him and said, look, come along with us to clean Mary's grave, but doesn't she deserve more than a grave? So and I think you've highlighted it, we have to get our history. We have to know what the history is. We shouldn't be putting people on pedestals. And then to get back to your question about in trying to explain why I got involved with sickle cell with other people, Mary Seacole with other people, we've got representatives here. I used the 3 Ps. And it was personal, professional, and political. Now, I'm not going to explain that. I think you can all identify. If you can, to me, that was the success, although I didn't realize, because why was I doing it in such a way? I was observing people who were successful. I was observing organizations that were successful within campaigns. So if that approach could be utilized in the education of nurses and midwives, that might be helpful. I just want to finish on one thing. She talked about my height. Did you hear her?
I knew that wouldn't pass you by.
Okay.
Longevity and height, that's a theme tonight.
It's okay. I've got a response.
She's always got a response.
Let me get this right. My short-term memory is not the most focused. Come on, the Jamaican. We little but we talawa. Thank you. We little but we talawa. Go look that up. Or, do you want to explain that? Go on.
Oh,
it's
God.
Jamaican.
It's a Jamaican phrase that says you might be small, but you're strong and you're tough.
You're mighty.
So
powerful,
apply
yeah.
that to nursing. Do you see what I mean? We little but we talawa. Don't. And you know what used to irritate me? Oh, It was when I could see round that table when they were talking strategy, policy, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I'd walk in the room, yeah, I know I was little. And they would just think, she's little. Hey, after, sorry. After
Stop
about,
getting your island up.
After about 15 minutes of listening, you heard the listening? Sophisticated use of our emotions. And the one that interests me in particular is anger. Because how angry is everybody at times? And I learnt by my errors the inappropriate use of anger. And it sort of, when I was doing the memoirs again, it came to me that anger is energy, either negative, well, it's not either, it's got negative and positive energy. And I think what helped me was reading about the likes of President Nelson Mandela, as an example, Angela Davis over in the United States. Oh, there's so many. Books help me enormously. Realize it's how you use your anger. And what I realized looking back, I was very lucky. I think we call them mentors now and allies. Yeah. There were a group of people that have helped me through my life, who've seen something in me and actually pointed out to me when I was using my anger inappropriately or giving me ideas of how to use my anger appropriately. Yes. Anger is good. Anger can be very good. And it's when you use the positive energy of anger with others to drive through the changes that you want. Because it's exhausting. You need some energy somewhere. Yeah. So anger, the energy of anger, the positive energy of anger, gosh, it surprises people. Yes. When you don't shut up, when you keep going on, you pull the evidence. You saw the evidence-based stuff? Because people need the arguments. They need the evidence. And just to finish, the best example that we ever saw as a groups of people campaigning for sickle cell, we're talking about, is when it was highlighted to the government officials, to all these people who could give us resources, was that actually there were more cases of sickle cell disease in this country than cystic fibrosis. Now, just pause there, because we're not pitting one illness against another. That would be outrageous. But we got information from our sources. You have to have sources, you know that. You have to have sources amongst the politicians, those people up there, the community, so you get your facts together. And we were saying, both of these illnesses are very serious, lifelong, unfortunately at times fatal. So, how come this condition is getting this amount of money and this condition is getting that amount of money? You answer us. If you can explain that away, we might go away, knowing that they couldn't explain that. So that's what I mean about the positive aspect of anger. Don't be worried if you're angry. Be worried if you're not using the energy of that anger appropriately. Yeah. We little but we can.
I think absolutely. And the other thing I asked, you asked a question about how we can get nurses and that to talk about it. And it links back to that thing about in our own minds, where the mind leads, the body follows. We think that our sphere of influence is only in this space. And it's so much greater. And if it helps, separate in your minds the idea of politics from politician. Because the politics of health is about distribution of resources. That's what it's about. Whether that resource is time, workforce, money, research, education, it's all about access to resource. And that's what we do every day in our work as nurses. Working with patients, with communities, with service users, with populations. We work out what resources are required and how we get access to that resource. If you pay that up and forward to policies and influencing what happens, it's the same thing. It's a continuation. one thing is codependent on the other. And maybe sometimes thinking about it, what I'm doing is arguing for resource rather than making a political point. And that is a different energy.
Okay. Thank you. So we have this young lady and then the gentleman at the back. I'm going to come to you.
Oh,
so
John is up there. John James, Chief Executive of the Sickle Cell Society. John, you should be.
So, okay, seeing Elizabeth outed you, John, would you like to ask your question and then I'll come to this here?
So, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Laura, for an insightful presentation. Now, the question that I'm raising is one that I want the profession to think about and your view. So, we've touched on sickle cell, and in terms of inclusivity and in terms of health inequalities, sickle cell remains very varied in the sense of the quality of treatment across the country. And we have a legacy to build on this great lady Elizabeth here. So the question is, have we got a voice as a profession to speak out about the inequities and variable standard of nursing for sickle cell patients? Because primarily, they affect people who look like me and you and people in this room. So the real question is, what voice, in the spirit of inclusivity, is the profession taking to change and improve the standards of care that people with sickle cell receive, which we all know is variable. And part of that is, in this day and age, some people saying, oh, well, we haven't really been trained about sickle cell, we don't know much about it. And I think that doesn't build on Elizabeth's long-lasting legacy that she's bringing to sickle and nursing.
Elizabeth, Laura.
I think the question for me, it's not what voice do we have. Linking on the point about equal chance and social justice, it's what voice are we willing to use. We've all got the voice, and it's a choice to speak or not speak. And I suppose the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we willing to speak or not speak about, either individually or collectively? And because that's what makes the difference.
And I think it's that people are scared about speaking out, putting their head above the parapet, because we see examples of how certain individuals have been penalised and their mental health affected and their career affected. So that's why this message of not trying to do it on your own and encircling yourself with allies, I think you're calling them now. And I'm going to give an example, and I want to actually give a positive example of something that came out of a negative situation, and to actually acknowledge that the health education, HEE, what does it stand for now?
England.
Health Education England.
Yes.
Is Liz Fenton here? I'm sure I
She's
saw
over
her.
there.
Liz, I would like to acknowledge the response that
Give a wave, Liz.
Give a wave. No, because I think this is the thing. We know, it's very clear through tragedies, unfortunately, sometimes, when something's gone drastically wrong. And the fact is that you can get a rallying around, led by the Sickle Cell Society, for example, and like-minded people, approaching organisations like Health Education England, and actually get a positive response. So I think it's a current example, Liz, isn't it? So there are ways that we can do it, but it isn't easy. I'm going to give you another example. I like to give current examples. I shouldn't laugh, but social media. Now, I actually do like Twitter. That's my platform of choice. And when people were telling me about the negative side of Twitter, for example, I hadn't experienced that. I think I do think usually before I tweet. But I want to give you an example that happened to me just last week. And this shows, it does show my naivety, but it also shows that it didn't turn out as bad as it could have been. So what happened? I tweeted, listen, I had the temerity, according to some people, to tweet that I enjoyed the last episode of Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, Archetypes podcast.
I love that podcast.
Whoa! My goodness. I was, well, my tweet is still there. You think I was going to take that off? You don't know me. It's still there. But this is where knowing how do we protect ourselves, because it can be vicious, the onslaught that you get. Now, this is a tiny example, but it was an onslaught. Do you know what saved the day for me? The mute button on Twitter. I wasn't going to block these people. I did not want to give them the satisfaction of saying, guess who blocked me? Look. I silenced them. Silence, look at that. See?
It was as if we know each other.
And we didn't prepare this. So
No.
I'm giving you that as an example. We have to be aware of the resources available to us. And it could be your best friend, it could be your colleague, it could be your boss, it could be the mute button on Twitter.
Oh, yes.
There you go.
Great.
And listen to the podcasts. They're very good.
Yeah.
Young lady here, and then we probably have one more.
Hi,
Yes.
I'm a third-year student midwife. I just wanted to ask how you continue to find the courage to speak out about discrimination when you're always faced with adversity and pushback.
So I'll just repeat it in case everybody didn't hear. This young lady is a student midwife, and you wanted to know how do you find the courage to continue to speak out about discrimination in this sort of adversity. Who would like to go first?
Anybody? I'm taking a deep breath. I was blessed, and I've learned now to say it's a blessing. I was blessed with the ability not to be quiet. As much as I tried I've often been silenced, but I choose not to be silent. And I couldn't help. There is something in me that there is a compulsion. There's a compulsion to speak out. And it doesn't always go well, and it doesn't always bode well. But actually, I feel that I've been gifted with that to a certain extent. And as I've got older, particularly, I know to choose to speak out and how to speak out. Because you learn, as you say, by getting it wrong, by watching other people, you learn. Because the important thing is getting the message across. And what you have to learn is the secret way to get the message across, whether that's using your anger positively or going round a different way to get the message. I think the thing that drives me is that hope that by speaking out, as I said, other people might speak, they get permission to speak, or if at the very least, I've kind of held people to account. I think that's the only thing. I've been telling my mum for years, I can't help it. It's just how it is. Just how it is.
One of the things I did gradually learn was that racism is never going to be eradicated. Mm-hmm. I know that somebody said, oh, Elizabeth. And I said, no. You know, I grew up in the era when it was thought education and, you know, What I think is more important to focus on is accepting that racism is there, but looking at how the organisation where you may have had a racist encounter, how does that organisation deal with it? In other words, action, not words. So do you remember the period, some of you will remember, we are an equal opportunity employer. Oh my goodness. And they put it at the bottom or
in
at the
small
top
writing.
of the letterheads. We are working towards anyway. The point is, this is again where you need to be linked in with your trade union, your professional association, your allies, your mentors, because you've got all sorts of, there's been a lot of work on trying to You know, this mentorship, preceptorship, is that another one?
Yeah.
But you've got to make them work for you, but you've got to work for it as well. So it's a two-way thing. And when I grew up, I realised I was occasionally missing cues that there were allies who were trying to help me, but they didn't really articulate it. They were actually keeping the door ajar. Do you know, oh, my brain's going to go, who's that? James Brown?
Yeah.
Yeah, the singer. He's too young. You're too young. Tell her about James, but he was lovely. He was a great singer. He had his issues, but, you know. But he made a statement, look, about equal opportunities. And he's saying, look, I don't expect you to keep the door wide open. I just want it slightly ajar. So basically you can, so to speak, you don't do that, but you find strategies to actually, and the most important thing I learned, not as a child, not as a teenager, but as an adult, probably in my late 20s, probably even in my 30s, was actually you've got to love yourself. Because society, in terms of how some of us have grown up, have pointed out to us that this colour skin, darker colour skin, is negative. And we've imbued that. And we don't love ourselves. We think there's something wrong with us. If so many people are decrying us, telling us we're lower than the lowest, it does have an effect on you. But you've got to work through that. You don't have to tell anybody. People who know me know that I can swear occasionally. I'm not suggesting I do. What I gradually learned is that I swore internally. So I'm smiling. I'm like Mother Teresa around some of these people that are like, ah! Inside, I'm saying exactly what I think about them. My daughter has pointed out, but Mummy, your face still shows it sometimes. Okay, so I've still got to work on that. But you can get help. You can get help with all of that now. You've got the internet, and this is where I can be a bit tough with students these days, sorry, because in my day, yeah, I'm 75, do you remember? So we have to go back. We didn't have, it was a textbook we were given as student nurses. Somebody's textbook for nurse, Medicine for Nurses by 2E. Yes. Who's got grey hair here? We weren't, I mean, I had good nurse tutors, don't get me wrong, but today you've got your phone and you can actually access resources so much more easily, and you can link in and you can find like-minded individuals, because somebody showed an old advert of eating porridge in the morning, and it gives you this
ready break.
Ready break. Oh, there you go.
I am that old.
It gives you this red warmth. Take you to go to school. It showed a little school kid going out into the cold. You need to build up whatever defences and support and love, internally, externally, that shields you from the negativity that is there in the world, unfortunately. So that when you experience that negativity, you deal with it in a positive way that doesn't draw you down and get you mentally ill or just give up. But you also need those allies, because you've got to have the human. Internet resources are okay, but you need that human support as well. So you've got to do a bit of work to find that. And that can be a bit tough if nobody's really highlighted that that's what you need to do. And just know your own worth. And I tell you, life becomes a heck of a lot nicer when you get that sorted out. And actually sometimes, you know something, I used to enjoy dealing with these idiots. Excuse me. So, you know, I hope that helps.
I think also the point to remember is don't fall into the trap of believing that your allies and supporters look a particular way, or occupy a particular space, or look like you. Look at the how people approach, what people do, not just think Because that's often when you miss cues, because people, your allies, supporters, your sponsors and your celebrators may not come in the package you expect them to come in. And similarly, your detractors equally don't come always.
So I think it's very much about values. They share those
It is.
values.
It's the value. It's how people show they are with you by what they do.
Great. Someone at the front, you had a question, and I'll come to you. This young lady, because yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Susan. I work with Karen. And I want to start by saying thank you for laying these strong roots for us and showing us the path. I just feel like you're shining this big torch from behind us.
We've all got torches.
Yeah. So the work that you have done and keeping on top of it, and it can be sometimes very difficult. So I just wanted to understand what was your strength and how you how did you keep going at those difficult times where you felt that you're reaching a brick wall in front of you?
I think it's a bit about, it goes to the allies and recognising those things. And it also goes back to the point that I made about giving yourself the permission, gifting yourself the permission to be imperfect, to be human. You know, there are 168 hours in a week. And if you sleep roughly about 7 hours, you're asleep for 49 of them. You can only do what you can within that space. And sometimes we can push ourselves to feel that we have to do everything and do it by ourselves. So your network and support is really key there. And sometimes you have to listen to voices that might be telling you just to stop. Sometimes you just have to stop the bus and get off for a bit, because that's what you need to do. But we can sometimes feel that we are pushed to keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Even sometimes within our own families, we have that position of being the one that's doing really well, that's doing the baton for the family, the first of your name. It's a heavy burden, and occasionally we just have to put it down. Sometimes we have to rest.
I talk about a virtual toolbox that you develop yourself, that you draw on when life really is tough, when you occasionally, historically, I've had this sense of blackness around me, which actually later on I realised I was starting to sink into depression. But somehow, what I now realise was this toolbox, elements of the toolbox was helping me. And you have to just sort of think, what can lift me out of this mood that I'm in? What can cheer me up when I've had a horrible encounter with somebody? Somebody in your family has annoyed you, come on, So things that are in my virtual toolbox is music and dancing. And having a long chat with people on the phone and putting the world to rights with a friend that we can trust, because where you know that it's not going to be relayed to the person you're talking about, because you would be in trouble then. Just have that toolbox. So for me now, I got asked this a lot during the various waves of COVID that we've had. What's kept me going? Because I was doing online stuff and people, how come you? And it made me think, what is it that helps me? I mean, to accept sometimes when you are a bit down, but what I like to think of is how can I pull myself out? I will not accept being down, And so, I mean, was it today or yesterday? I can't remember. Somebody annoyed me. I won't say who. It wasn't you, Karen.
That's a relief.
It may have been somebody on the come on, look at the situation we're in at the moment in this country. Come on, it's irritating, it's worrying, it's frightening, it's depressing, and that can overwhelm you. No, I'm retired, so look at you all working and trying to deal with all these issues, and I knew exactly what I needed to do, which was, because I knew my neighbour was out, was turn up the volume a bit, and I've got to, you all use playlists, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, You see, these 75-year-olds, I've got a particular playlist that just gets me dancing. And the first track on, I don't know whether you know this one, Jezebel, the soca. Who's into soca music? So there's one, do you know Jezebel? Oh, just find it. Because anything with a bit of drum and bass for me is good as well. Garage is all right as well. We don't stereotype here, do we? So I'll just give this as a quick example. I just put this track on, played it a bit loud, and I was just dancing around the room. And within 3 minutes, I just kept replaying it. The endorphins, I presume, something kicked in, and I thought, yeah, I felt fine. And you've just got to think about what makes you joyful, happy, that calms you down and brings you back into focus that you're a good person, that it's them. But having said that, humility as well. When somebody's pointed out something in a way that they want to improve your performance, we have to be able to take that on board in the spirit that it's given. But, maybe a teaspoon of honey to help us,
swallow
the
it
medicine go down. Yeah.
There's something about when we talked about the eye of the storm, what is it that sustains you in that? I've got a playlist that's entitled Powerful Me.
Ooh.
There you go.
So tonight, start your playlist, all right?
Yes.
Okay, so I know Maveline has a question. Maveline, I thought you were asking me permission to leave the room earlier on when you put your hand up and I nodded like this. So I do apologize. Do you want to ask your question, Maeve?
I think this...
So no, Maveline was before this young lady. That's what I'm saying.
There you
when
go.
Maveline put her hand up, I thought she wanted to leave.
I'm just showing that I saw you.
Yeah, we will get to you. Maeve. I promise.
Yeah.
Those protective mechanisms, I guess, for self.
I think the thing is, you want to prevent that anger from those individuals or from whoever, from destroying you.
Yes.
That's what you've got to continue. Are you going to let them destroy you? I know that's a very simplistic way because it's very, very complex. And it's knowing when you can't overcome it, and it is overwhelming, that you seek help. So it's not to give you the impression that necessarily your virtual toolbox will always work, but at least try what's in your virtual toolbox.
Take the sting
Just get into the habit of recognizing when your mood is... But the other thing, you started off by the frustration I sense of the inequalities. Let's talk about health inequalities. And the frustration that many of these are not getting resolved. And that was certainly how I felt in my earlier health career. What helped me was somebody suggesting to me that I just focus on a couple of them, that you can't sort them all out, even if you're in a big group or organization. Focus on a few that you feel that you can, with others, get involved and do something about. And somebody said to me, that's a bit depressing, isn't it? And I said, well, actually, it's life. If you read, if you watch documentaries, whatever way you learn about how others have dealt with it. History does teach you that we go through cycles, that at times we're up, at times we're down. And the most important book I read, it wasn't a book actually, it was the speech of Nelson Mandela at the Riviera trial, before he was sentenced to that long, long imprisonment. And it was his speech, The Long Walk to Freedom, which then became obviously his autobiography. But that speech, right at the end, he talks about he's willing to die. And I'm thinking, my goodness, I feel down. This guy is willing to die for his principles. It just helped me put things into perspective when I was overwhelmed. And it made me realize I can't, even my friends and my other, can't sort everything out. Now, it might be difficult to live with that, mightn't it? That you can't solve all the problems. But if you're fighting and campaigning, or in whatever way you want to act, because that's the other thing, not everybody wants to be out on the streets, not everybody wants to be a politician, not everybody wants to get up on a platform and speak. But they can do things that suit their temperament. There are different ways that people can get involved. And I refuse to believe that there isn't one way, even the most timid individual can't get involved in the quality of care for their patients or whatever it is. I refuse to believe that we can't do anything, even if it's a small bit of action. Because if you get to the point where you think you can't do anything, that's when you're going to be very depressed, I think.
So, Elizabeth, time's not my friend, but seeing Laura pointed out this young lady, you'll ask a very quick question and Laura will give a very quick response.
That's telling us, isn't
That's
it?
telling us.
Well, I have another person telling me, put it that way. Young lady.
I wrote my question down so I don't forget because I had it so long.
All right, that's like 1 minute of your question time gone already. Sure.
So this question is for both of you. In finding your journeys to your voices, do you feel that you had to choose specialist areas that nobody was clinically interested in or was more mentally draining in order to build your career where you are now? Because sickle cell and AIDS, those were two areas I worked in when I was a student nurse, and when I went in here, both of them were put on the same ward, same unit, and it was all black nurses that worked in the unit. And as a champion in your field, what would you like to see aspiring, diverse educators as ourselves focus on to keep your legacies going? That's my question, because we are educators and we want to push the boundaries, be representatives and representation across the board for inclusivity, diversity, and the unsocial injustices that happen amongst people. So what areas would you advise us to champion that's not being championed, instead of looking at the things that has more money or more voices?
Okay, Laura, over to you. My question time now. I have to wrap up.
I think there were two questions in there, wasn't there?
I wanted your journey to your decision.
I am not conscious of making a conscious decision to choose the area that I worked in. It was, I kind of feel like it chose me. I think because I've always worked and been interested in working around what I now call social justice. I didn't call it then, it was equal chance. I just want everyone to have an equal chance. Okay, that's where I started with it. And time-wise, the last great pandemic hit the time when I was working, and nobody wanted to do that work. And, so I thought, well, I'll do it then. It wasn't a conscious thing I'd ever even dreamt of. Like most about COVID, we didn't know about AIDS till we were in it. We didn't know about COVID till we were in it. So that was kind of how it went. And the thing, I went in it as an area of clinical practice, and I became absorbed in it as an area of social justice. The social justice came out of being and seeing the inequity that was embedded within the life and experiences of all the people I worked with.
It chose you.
It chose me.
Elizabeth, I'll give you a 60-second response.
It's what hits you, for me, when you're in practice that demonstrates health inequalities. And it was visiting a mother of a 9-year-old boy with sickle cell anemia when I was a health visitor. And she was asking me questions about it, and I couldn't answer her. And when I realized, why wasn't I able to answer her? I hadn't had anything about sickle cell anemia in my nurse education, 1965 to 1968 in London. And Mary Seacole was actually the same as well. That's why I got into it, because I was never taught about her. And when I did discover her, I didn't discover her, but when I started to learn about her in 1984, what did I learn? She was buried a quarter of a mile down the road from where I trained as a nurse. That's what I mean, the anger. And then you think, you get called by Lord Clive Soley, would you like to join the Mary Seacole? You bet. Because I called my nursing practice, finish this, and I've got my timekeeper here. When I became a professor of nursing at the University of West London, I was able to set up my own small research centre. And I had come across groups of nurses, students I should say. I used to go in and talk to the groups of 20 at a time. And in one of, I think the second session I did, I mentioned Mary Seacole because somebody asked a similar question. How do you deal with with racism? How do you deal with this? How did you deal with it? And I thought, do you know? And then I said, well, do you know about Mary Seacole? Do you know how she dealt with issues? Mary Seacole. And this was the late 1990s. Come on. So I thought, right, what can I do? I didn't articulate it. I was thinking, hold on, I'm about to set up a research centre. Let me call my research centre after Mary Seacole, because people are going to have to say, who's she? And they did. Who is she? So I told them. That's how it works with some people. But you have to work out partly yourself. Yeah. You are the role models that the students are looking up to as well. So don't denigrate, don't deny what passions you have that you can impart to your students.
Yeah. And the last thing I will say, because I can see Calvin.
He's about to hit you.
Listen, right, I'm going to be giving him side-eye in a minute. So anyway, the other thing that I would say as an educator, which is really, really important, if we're going to impact the equity and social justice for all populations, all the workforce, then we have to make sure that all the students, irrespective of their background and experience, also know all the information.
Exactly.
Because whether I get a chance, whether my children's children get a chance, might not depend on someone who has any experience, expert by experience of that. It might depend on somebody who has grown up in an area that isn't diverse. And their only opportunity to learn that is what they get taught when they're actually on their training. So we have to embed with everybody in order that all of us have an equal chance.
Yeah, very good.